My name is Allison Felis, and this is I'll Follow You, a podcast featuring light and lively conversations about film, music, and creative culture, coming to you from the People's Republic of Rogers Park on the far northeast side of Chicago. One of the whack-a-mole topics of conversation that recurs periodically on social media is this whole notion of the side hustle. Do you take one of your hobbies that you're really good at and then turn it into something you make money off of? Or do you protect that hobby at all costs and instead turn to it as an escape from whatever your daily grind may be? While of course there are plenty of arguments for and against both of those options, I feel like a big part of what I'm trying to do with this podcast specifically is shining a light on people who take sort of a third route, where it's a little more difficult to dismiss these major parts of people's lives as just a hobby, even if it's not something they make any money from or gain any significant notoriety for. But I think there's way more interesting and way less reductive ways to think about the specific things that people commit their time and attention and energy to. And so I'm super excited for all those reasons to be able to introduce you to my good friend, Michael Sherron. There's any number of things he and I could have spent an hour talking about, but I specifically wanted him to talk about the process that he's recently been through of becoming a docent at the Phoenix Art Museum in Arizona. He's currently an apprentice docent from the class of 2018 and now leads tours there for adults and school groups. In his day job, he's an engineering manager building large-scale cloud hosting solutions for the enterprise. Mike is one of the most remarkable people I know in terms of his sheer capacity to tackle incredibly ambitious projects simply for the joy of learning how to do them. That deep focus and insatiable curiosity is definitely at the heart of what led him to commit the past 2 years of his life to studying really intensely in order to start giving tours at the Phoenix Art Museum. So in addition to talking about what the program was like in our chat here today, in the last 20 so minutes, Mike will guide me through a deeper look at two paintings from the Phoenix Art Museum's collection, Lou Davis's The Rebel and Frida Kahlo's The Suicide of Dorothy Hale. So here's my conversation with Mike Sherron. Enjoy. So, Michael, I'm so pleased that you're here today to chat about your art docenting.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Happy to be here.
So I would love it if you would just sort of talk us through how this even came into your life to begin with, that this was, it was a couple years ago. And I remember talking to you at the beginning of the journey where you're like, yeah, this is this thing that I'm going to do now. And then suddenly 2 years passed and it was this huge chunk of your life. And I would love to just go back to the beginning of the process and how it all started for you.
I've always really been into volunteerism. It's just something that I feel is important to have in your life in order to be connected to your community and other people. And but the stuff that I had been doing previously, it didn't really have any kind of I guess a performance aspect to it. And that's always something that I really liked when, I was in high school and college. I did theater stuff and choir stuff. And I really liked being in front of people. And that was something that I missed from some of the things that I'd been doing in early adulthood. And so I saw a post on Facebook where the Phoenix Art Museum was looking for docents, which are basically tour guides to take school tours and public tours and basically talk to people about art. And I just thought that sounds really cool. And so I went to, they had a informal, coffee chat, right? Where there was probably, 50 of us that came in, and we listened to other docents in the program speak. And they kind of told us a little bit about the program and how it worked. It's a 2-year program. And I just thought it sounded really great. And so just, signed up, and I had to do kind of a little audition kind of thing, sort of, where we went and we walked through an exhibit as a group, and they kind of had us talk together, and they gave us some questions, and we had to kind of impromptu present on a couple works of art and kind of lead a conversation, and I got accepted to the program, and I've been doing it ever since. It was great.
So what was it specifically about the art aspect that you were like, oh yeah, this is a thing, rather than, any other sort of, volunteer thing that you could have gotten involved with?
Well, I always like our art museum is really great in Phoenix. I mean, just besides being like a pretty solid museum, the building is awesome, and it's a place to go. Honestly, like Phoenix is so ridiculously hot that I in the almost 20 years that I've lived here, in the summertime, like it was a place that I always go when I just want to walk for a long period of time and not literally melt. So I've just always really liked going there, and I've just always really dug art, So the idea that I could combine, talking to people and telling stories with like actively learning about art and art history, it just sounded really cool. Just because that's just my brain just always craves learning new things, and I don't know, something about it just jumped out at me as being like, hey, this would be a really cool thing to do. So.
Because what was your major? Like, I don't even remember like what you majored
Oh
in.
God.
I mean, not that it matters, but
No. So I initially was a theater major, and then decided that like I was going to go poor doing that. So I switched to education, which clearly that's a better strategy, right? And then quickly didn't really dig that either, and then kind of fell into technology through just a series of jobs that I had, and now today I'm a software engineer. But and that part's great. I love my job. But it's not. It doesn't really have very much like performance aspects, or I don't know, really talking to people sometimes. So this is just something that really satisfies that part of me. That likes to be in front of people, likes to share, likes to tell stories.
Yeah, because I guess the question sort of behind the question was like, how the art aspect fit into it. I mean, because it's like, I do think of you as like a very creative person. I mean, since we know each other from theater experiences, and yeah, and I knew, yeah, obviously I knew that you like work in tech, but I just couldn't remember like how the how the dots connected from one place to the next.
Yeah. I mean, just from attending the session and just having a relationship with the museum, and then just the idea that like I could be affiliated with this institution and actually then have art and storytelling be a part of my everyday. I don't know, it just really jumped out at me as being like, yes, that is a thing that I should go and do.
Because
And now, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you'd had any experience with docents prior to seeing the ad, like in the time that you'd been at the museum. Had you ever sort of like been on a tour with one, or like saw one of them across the room or anything?
Sure. I mean, the past 20 years I've been doing software engineering, and probably for the past 10, I've been doing a lot of consulting. And so I travel a lot. When you're traveling alone for work, it's, museums are a really great thing to do when you kind of have some time to kill, right? And typically when you're in a new city, museums usually have at least one day a week where they're open late at night. So I'll be in, random city, and, the art museum will be open late. And so I'll go in and they'll have a docent tour, and I'll get to go and learn some cool new stuff and see some things that I've never seen before. And so I guess I've always been familiar with docents. It's just a thing that I've always dug. And just the idea to be able to be a part of that was just really appealing.
That's fantastic. So then you were like, yes, sign me up, and you got accepted. And so like, what was that like? Like, what was the training process like? I know, like I said, I know it was a pretty hefty time commitment, on top of being a parent and being a husband and being, working person.
Yeah, so I'm really fortunate in that I work for a company remotely. So I work from home. So my schedule is very flexible, right? As long as, my stuff gets done, my company is pretty great about letting me kind of, fit this in the middle of my workday. So the class is on Mondays, and it runs about half of the day. So I just block my calendar and I go into class, and we learn about art history, and it's really, it's not like a formal art history program, although there's a long story to that. Now, I guess the current trend in docenting is that it's less about trying to create like a lecture environment. We're not trying to stand in front of a painting and, tell you what you need to know about this thing, right? It's more about creating a conversation, right? How do we help people have a relationship with this piece of art, right? So, it's really more about learning techniques and skills in order to draw that conversation with people and to get them involved and to help them have a personal experience, as opposed to like sitting there and formally learning about art movements and, who was big in the 19th century versus the, Renaissance or whatever, right? We do learn that stuff, but it's not that formal or complex. It's really more about getting a lot of time in front of people and learning to be comfortable, frankly, with public speaking, which a lot of people find challenging. And then also just being able to lead conversations and have, have those really fun, interesting conversations, right? Because it can be tough, right?
Was that like your superpower in the training, like among your fellow like students who were studying? Were you like the guy who was known as like, yes, like Mike is going to talk?
So yes, although that kind of burned me a couple times. I mean, so I definitely quickly got a reputation for being not afraid to talk, right? Which, like that's just been me my whole life. Like I like talking to people, and I like, being kind of a class clown. And so, whenever like they were looking for volunteers to be the first person to talk about a thing, people were like, Michael, go, make him do it. And I would always volunteer. But then actually I kind of got in trouble the first time I had honestly, the first time I had a reviewed tour. I got dinged pretty hard because they said, you're really making this more about you, about, telling funny stories than, making it about the art and like having an open conversation. And so that actually was something that I kind of struggled with because
Wow.
I really wanted it to be more of a performance than a conversation. And, that's a fine line you have to walk.
How did you adjust tack on that? Like once you got that bit of feedback?
You just have to have more questions, right? So, and then there's a technique, right, where you're supposed to like intersperse what we call info bombs. That's kind of the cute term for it in docenting, where like you're taking those little nuggets of information, those interesting stories, right? And instead of just like blasting out of the gate with like one big story, you ask an open-ended question and you kind of ask the different people in the room, well, how do you feel about that? Did you agree with that? Do you think something differently? And obviously you don't, you have to acknowledge what people say, and there's no wrong answers, and support people so that they feel comfortable talking. And then as they give you responses, then you kind of sprinkle in those info bombs and you give those stories and you make little jokes, but you kind of have to break it up and you have to make it part of the conversation, which is challenging, right? Like if it's not something that you're used to doing, it's a skill for sure, like anything else.
Well, and it sounds like it's this really interesting mix of, obviously the art history component, but then, and performance too, that you as you mentioned, but then also like psychology, like there's got to be like some psychological aspects to like, how do you make people feel comfortable? How do you set them at ease? How do you get them to engage? Like, were they explicit about that? Like in the training?
Yeah. They ask you to do things like, making sure you're validating people's responses. You never say no to people. You try to ask direct questions to people. Maybe if they're being a little bit shy, you kind of have to work your way back to people. Like, if you try and throw a question at somebody and they don't give you something right away, then you kind of, leave them alone for a little bit and go and talk to the people over here who do want to play, but then try to find ways to invite that person in, as you start to develop rapport with them. It's a whole thing.
So tell me a little bit more about like just, your experience in the classes. I mean, because what was sort of the demographics of your fellow docents and how that all worked as a cohort?
So the first day that I went in for class, the teacher pulled me aside and she said, "Now, Michael, I just wanted to check with you. Like, that you're the only man in this class. Are you going to be comfortable with that?" And yeah, I'll be okay. Like, I have 3 sisters. I'll be fine. So yeah, I mean, that was interesting, right? To be in a space that is overwhelmingly female, right? Was frankly really different and really a privilege, right? Like there's not a lot of opportunities for guys my age to be in that kind of a group, right? So I thought it was really great.
Because so was it like you guys went through, was it similar to like high school or college where you guys like traveled through with the same people
Hmm.
like year to
Yeah.
year? So
Yeah,
it was
so
the
we
same.
like it's funny, like the docent body we refer to ourselves by the year that we started, right? So I'm class of 18, I'm class of, and somebody else will say they're class of 2004 or whatever. I mean, we have people who are in the docent body who are now master docents. They've been touring for 10 years. We have people who have been touring way longer than that. But everybody refers to the calendar year in which they started. So we're the class of 2018. And
Gotcha.
we probably started with, I'm just going to pull a number out of the clear blue sky. I want to say we started with like 30 people, and I think we're down to like, I don't know, somewhere between 15 and 20 now.
Oh, wow.
People drop a lot because it's like you said earlier. I mean, it is hard. It's a big time commitment, and it's mostly retirees, right? I would say, by far the majority of the people are folks who are no longer currently working, although there are a bunch of us who are still working. And it just the folks of us who are working, it's usually because we have some type of a career that allows us to be flexible, right? So people who are either working remotely or they have employees overseas, or maybe they're they own their own business and things like that, where they can kind of make their own schedule to work around the program.
And so was the focus specifically on, I mean, I'm guessing it probably was, but specifically on docenting in the Phoenix Art Museum? It wasn't, it's not really an applicable, I mean, how applicable of a skill set is it, like, if you would ever move to a different city and want to, like, take up docenting, like, in a different museum context?
I don't there I mean, it's not like, so when I finish the program here in a couple of months, it's not like it's not a degree program. There's no licensing, there's no certification, right? There is an American Association of Docents. I think that's the correct term. I can't recall, but I know that it exists. That you can join, and you have a membership too, and you're part of the community of museum educators, right? But it's not like a formal program, right? But I have talked to museums in other parts of the country and asked them, if for some reason I were to move to another city, like, would it be difficult to become a docent in another museum? And they mostly giggled and said yes, that would be fine, because they can. It's very difficult to find people who are able to volunteer, right? Like any other volunteer program, and this one has special skills, so yeah, it would be fairly easy for me to move to another program, but you still have to learn their collection, right? So like
Right.
our museum has an education wing. It's a whole separate building that has a library in it, and we have an archive, and our the actual collection is tens of thousands of pieces, but we only have like a couple few thousand that are on display at any one point in time. And you have to learn to be reasonably well versed in a big chunk of the collection, right? Because especially when you're doing the school tours, you don't really get to pick what you're going to talk about that day. The way that it works is they set up a grid where there's a school. It's usually an entire grade, right? So the whole fifth grade class from Glendale Science will come in that day, and so it's usually somewhere around between like 8 and 10 or 12 groups, right? And each group will have like 10 kids in it, and they'll have a chaperone. And so then they'll take the museum and they'll divide it up into a grid. And so basically they'll plan out, for each of these galleries, this docent will be in this gallery for 10 minutes, and then they move to this gallery for 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. And so you basically have to know, for all the galleries with all the pieces that are up at any given point in time, I need to be familiar with at least 2 to 3 of them, so that I can talk to them, right? I can lead a tour. And there's different themes that we have to be familiar with, like STEAM is a big one, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, and art, STEAM. And so we have to be able to talk about, like, the kids come to the museum and you ask them, hey, would you be surprised if we could talk about science all day at the art museum? And they go, what? No, it's an art museum. And you go, okay, but I guarantee you we're going to talk about science. And so then you go, and at each painting, you find some type of tie-in to science or technology or engineering, and you'd be surprised. That's actually a pretty not that difficult thing to do.
Well, as soon as you said steam, I was kind of like, oh, are like talking about like trains and like English, like in like Turner's paintings or something like.
No, no. Science and technology. But like people love it. Like it's yeah. So getting back to your question, right? Like you do have to spend a lot of time given whatever facility that you're working in, and this is the same whether you're an art museum docent or maybe you like work at like a historical site, or I went into in near Tucson, there's the Titan Missile Museum, right? It's a former decommissioned missile silo that they have docents who will give tours, and they'll explain this is how this missile system worked, and this is what would have happened if there had been an event where we were firing nukes at Russia, right? Like this is what the process would have looked like. And those folks are clearly incredibly informed, and they have to go through a very a pretty intense training program to learn to be able to answer all the questions that people would have, and lead a meaningful discussion.
Because yeah, it seems like the need to not only like within yourself acquire this body of knowledge where you can, talk about these things and be very well educated on the art history and all that, but then to be able to take that body of knowledge and use it to talk to elementary school kids or sort of like older adults who are coming in just like on a day trip or like tourists or something, to be able to sort of like hold those conversations with different people, finding them where they're at. I mean, yeah, it's very impressive skill set.
The kids are easier, to be honest with you. Like out of all those groups that you just described, the little kids are the easiest because they they don't come with any preconceived notions about art. They don't come with any fear about talking about things that they don't understand. They're just wide open, right? And they're there to play, right? So when you come to them and you say, something like you're looking at a sculpture and you say like, what do you think would happen if we could time travel with this sculpture to ancient Rome? Like they'll just bite right into that question. Like they'll go crazy for it. And whereas like with adults, it can be a little bit more challenging because they don't want to be wrong, right? That's the biggest problem that you have to work through with adults is like we've seen through pop culture and movies or whatever that when you talk about art, like it's seen as like this kind of snooty skill set, and it's like, well, if you can't talk about impressionists and the old masters, then you don't know what you're talking about, and you have to work through all that. You have to just front load people and explain to them like, hey, there's no wrong answers. Like we're not don't come and assume that I first of all, I don't know everything about art history. I am at best a baby art historian, right? But it's really more about just like let's learn how to look at art together and have a conversation as opposed to just kind of looking at it and saying like, yeah, I like that, or no, I didn't like that, and moving on to the next thing. Let's slow down a little bit and let's have a conversation about it and maybe have an experience.
No, that's amazing. Because again, you mentioned this sort of earlier on, but that is a very new, or I shouldn't say new, but like sort of that's what's current in the way that people sort of like train and in what the experience of being in an art museum is, where it's away from that sort of like hardcore sort of like info dump, of like what art history details, and it's more that experiential thing.
Right. Right. And and sometimes it's really hard. Like, for example, we have an exhibit that is, it's classic cars, 22 cars, from, the turn of the century all the way to the end of the 20th century, all throughout the history of racing. And they're incredible. I mean, these are amazing machines that you have 100% heard of. Like, even if you're not a car person, like, like if you've seen the Ford versus Ferrari movie that just got a bunch of Oscars, like we have one of those cars from that movie is in this exhibit.
Oh, cool.
And Shelby Cobra and Ferraris, probably it's one of the most expensive automobiles in the entire world. And people come in and they want to talk about these things. Like they want to, like, especially guys, like big carhead guys who come in and they're like, we want to talk about spark plugs and tires and disc brakes and like, horsepower. And I like, hey guys, I am not your dude for that. Like, I don't know those stories, but I do know some really cool stories about what happened in some of the races that these cars were in. And so we talk about that. And then, having conversations with, like with kids, like, hey, what's different with this race car from, 1923 from the car that your mom and dad drive? what's different between those two things? And so then you talk about that. Well, they didn't really need windshields or rearview mirrors in the early days of racing because that's just not something they were concerned about. Safety, who needs that, right? It's glory or nothing. So that kind of stuff it can be really challenging.
No, that's super cool because that's something that I'm definitely just curious about how, like how that is, like I was asking before, like group to group, like, and I love the idea that these gearhead guys come in and are maybe stereotypically not the kind of dudes who maybe necessarily are coming to the museum to see the old masters, but like
right.
the cars get them in, and that's like a way to start a conversation, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And then have really interesting conversations like, is this art? Right? Like let's look at this car together. Like, would you consider this art? And most everybody will say yes, right? But then you kind of start talking about the engineering and all the different steps that took a specific racing team to get from a prototype or from a design to a prototype to an actual production car, right? And when you learn about the engineering behind that stuff, you realize like, man, this is way more complicated than like, I don't know, building a toy box, right? Like this is an incredibly complicated piece of machinery that also needs to look good, right? That needs to be beautiful. It's really interesting.
No, that's super cool. So what was that like? I mean, again, as you were sort of like gaining the skill set, like to give these kind of tours, like when did they cut you loose? Like was that pretty early on that they were kind of like, okay, enough to go make a mess,
No, they basically the first year is your trainee year. And you start off very light where you maybe will just give a 15-minute talk about one painting that you spend some time studying, and you just give it to your class, right? And then I think the second assignment that we did was a compare and contrast between two paintings. And then that was still one that was just internal within the class. And then throughout that year, they encourage you to go and follow other docents. So you'll just kind of shadow a docent who's on a live tour, either with students and they make you go on just about every type of tour that the museum offers. So you have to go on some student tours, you have to go on some public adult tours, and you just shadow, just kind of watch the docents, see how they do, ask a lot of questions, take notes. And then, as you get towards the end of your first year and into your second year, then they start having you do shared tours where basically you would be with a more experienced docent and they would do, half of it. And then you would do the second half, or maybe you would just do one gallery and they would do the other three galleries. And then, after you've done that a few times, they set you up with a mentor, right? So I had a really great mentor, Lisa, who I really hit it off with, and she also came from an engineering background, so we clicked immediately, and so I did a lot of practice tours with her, and then eventually went through a review, where that was the first review where I kind of got dinged on a little bit about making it a little bit too much about me. And then went back to the drawing board and worked through with her and kind of learned some new ways to approach things. And then once you kind of made the adjustments that she felt I needed to make, then we did a review again and passed. And then once you get through that first reviewed tour, where it's basically you've done a whole hour, and you've done it with a live classroom, and the reviewers are with you on the tour and they take notes and they give you feedback at the end, then you're allowed to do live tours. They call it you're cleared for touring. So at that point you can sign up for either student tours or public tours. I do mostly public tours now with adults. Just it's easier to fit into my schedule than because the school tours are always right in the middle of the workday.
Sure.
But I do try to do an occasional school tour because the kids are really cute. It's really fun.
So how has this sort of, this is sort of a broad question, but like how has the docenting process and the way that you've had to train your brain to learn to do this, like is there bleed over into the rest of your life in the way that you pay attention to things, the way that you notice details about things, in the way that you talk to people in general? Like, do you notice anything that's changed in that way?
Yes. Yeah, hugely. In fact, I've been saying this to some of my coworkers, like I really wish like there is a way that I could distill some of these things into like a program that I could just like smash into people's heads. Got it. Just in terms of like, learning how to meet people where they're at and have a conversation with them. And, it's almost like some of the same things that you learn in improv, like
Mm.
where you learn, you're never, denying someone's reality, right? Like you're just looking for the similarities and you're kind of ignoring the differences, and you're just trying to find the meaty bits where there's connections, right? And just kind of iterate on those, and also to realize that everything is just about everybody's point of view, right? There's especially when it comes to art, right? There's no wrong answer. Like I can look at a painting with 10 different people, and I guarantee you, if I don't give them any information, if I don't lead them down any paths, right, I'm going to get 10 different answers about that painting, right? And all of them are awesome and all of them are valid, right? And so, then like turning that over into like a work environment, right? Where it's like I'm engineering a website, right? You start talking to people about what their ideas are for a thing, for how a website should look. And, you come up with 10 different ideas. And it's really easy to like, start like knocking things down without really inspecting them, especially as an engineer, because we're trained to like, manage risk and to look for things that are frankly bad ideas, right? So we go like, no, we're not going to do that one because I think it's some arbitrary bad idea for this reason, right? But instead of doing that, you just say, wait, no, let's talk about this some more. Like, let's really explore all these different ideas. And invariably, I find even if I initially felt negative towards a certain point of view, if I spend a little bit more time inspecting it, there's always a kernel of something good in there. Like always,
Mm.
it's impossible to miss that. Like if you just spend a little bit more time hearing people out, there's going to be something useful and good in there that you can kind of find compromises on.
What a healing. That's so beautiful. Like, I mean, because, it's easy to make broad, you know, broad statements about like, the way that people talk to each other now in society and on social media and whatever. But we really, people sort of as a rule are kind of trained to, like you said, look for difference. I mean, especially, like you mentioned in an engineering capacity. But I think that yeah, it's very easy to look for like points of disagreement, but to actively have spent the last 2 years training yourself to resist that, and to look for commonalities and look for ways to like hear people out and hear where people are coming from. Like that's amazing.
Yeah, and like, and look in cultures who maybe look different than my culture or my time or my life experience, and try to find commonalities in that, right? Like if I'm looking at a painting from 19th century France, well, it's helpful for me to learn a little bit about 19th century France in order to understand where that artist was coming from, or maybe what they were interested in or what they were trying to talk about. And that goes, I mean, we have art from all over the world, right? And so just spending more time learning about those different cultures is just amazing, right?
Is
And
that
then
like a
like, go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, that reminded me of a really cool experience that I got to have last year, where we had this exhibit on Islamic art, and I was doing a school tour of girls who were coming from an Islamic women's school, and just watching how they like their reaction to the exhibit, right? Like you could tell like they felt represented in a way that they didn't get in a lot of other places. You know what I mean? We're like, well, for one thing, the first thing that was really funny is we're going through the exhibit, and there's, I mean, these beautiful pottery and Qurans and prayer boards and all these different things, and they were really into that. And then there was weapons, which like every other school group was like really excited about because they're little kids and they see weapons and they think it's amazing. These girls couldn't care less about that. They were like, no, I want to see more Quran, I want to see more text, and like just they were so excited that this was something that they felt like ownership and a relationship with.
Mm.
And then then at the end of the exhibit, there was like a video that was showing images of mosques from all over the world. And just showing how the architecture of mosques is very different depending on what country they're in, and that there's just a huge variety, right? And so they're showing mosques from Germany, from the United States, from Iran, from all over the place. And there was one girl who was really excited. She's like, they got to show Turkey, they got to show Turkey. And then when they did show a mosque from Turkey, like you could just see how she lit up because that's where her family was from. And she
Mm.
even said something like, that's my people, or that's my mosque. And just being like, getting to be a part of that, like getting to see that level of connection that she was feeling, like, I mean, that's just a privilege, right? Like, that's amazing.
That's so cool. And so does that ever happen like on the opposite side, like where you can get people to sort of like a level of understanding from a culture that they're not part of? I mean, does that happen for people, who might suddenly, have a light bulb moment about like, oh, this, culture that seems super foreign to me, like now through the artwork, I have a greater level of understanding, or I find myself more curious. Have you experienced that with people?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? Like, because I don't get to go home with them and see, like, did we, like, our talk about, China, like, did that make them more interested in Chinese culture? I honestly don't know, right? But, I like to think, when we're able to, especially from like, pieces of art that are from, an older time, right? Like, when we try to make connections between what's depicted in the art and what maybe their life experience is like, and then seeing them understand, like, finding some type of connection in their own experience, like, it happens a lot. Like, you'd be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that's kind of, the usually the canned answer that people give to sort of like the enriching qualities of art, like find yourself in the stories of other people and in the experiences of other people who don't necessarily have the same experience, but there's commonalities that can be had. So yeah, I'm always curious if that's just like a truism that we tell ourselves, like liberal arts majors, to like pat ourselves on the back, or if that's something that actually does occur when people interact with art.
I mean, I think it does. I guess I'm struggling a little bit, like coming up with any like specific anecdotes. I'll say though, like, that you can flip that around on the other side, right? Like, I think there's a lot of really challenging things that are happening in the art world and the museum space that I think people are struggling with. Our museum, in particular, because we're in Arizona, we have a lot of art that's like, images, stereotypical images of the American West. So, like, a lot of, cowboys being cowboys, and, cowboys fighting Indians, and like a lot of, imagery of Native Americans that, some folks struggle with, frankly, right? And, for good reason. And not to say that it's all bad. I think a lot of it is really good. It's just that it gets complicated really quickly, right? And I had a tour once where there was a woman who just very frankly just called me out on it and just said, like, I think a lot of the imagery that was in a particular gallery that we were looking at, there were multiple pieces, and she's saying, like, I think a lot of this is like really Eurocentric, imagery of Native Americans. And and being kind of like a baby docent, like, I kind of panicked a little bit, and I just said, I totally, get why you feel that way, and just kind of moved on. And I kind of wish that I had, pulled her aside maybe a little bit and said, hey, can we talk a little bit at the end? Because I agree with her, right? But the question is, like, what do we do differently, right? Like, it's, we have a couple hundred years now of art that's been created on these themes. It's for better or for worse, it's part of the canon now. So what do we do with it, right? Do we just not talk about it? Do we just cancel it, right? Another example is like Picasso, right? Like, he has an incredibly, complicated history with women, and just a lot of really bad stories in light of like our current contemporary lens, and Me Too and all of those things. So what do we do with Picasso? Do we just cancel him? Like, you can't. I don't know that you can do that, right? It feels like what we should do is try to tell the whole story, try to maybe give some of these women in Picasso's life, a chance for their stories to be heard, so that we get the whole context. But, as a museum, how do you do that, right? You can't have a didactic that's like, and a didactic is the wall text on the little plaque that's next to the piece of art. Like, you can't have a didactic that's like,
30 feet long, right? Like you're limited in how much information you can relay at any given point in time. So it's a really like there's no easy answer, right? Like this is a really big challenge for museums and cultural institutions to how do we talk about this stuff in a way that is productive, right?
Because is it just out of curiosity with the Native American stuff, is it just paintings, or do you have artifacts from different tribal groups from the area too?
We don't have artifacts, no. So we actually have a sister museum, the Heard Museum here in Phoenix, which is an amazing institution. If any of your listeners happen to be in town, I highly recommend it. And it is completely focused on indigenous art and indigenous artists. So most of any like Native American stuff that is here in town is more likely than not going to be at the Heard Museum. And the stuff that's in Phoenix Art Museum that is on those themes is honestly generally by people of European descent, right? We only have a couple of paintings that are by Native American artists themselves. That's challenging, right? It can be tough.
No, I just asked because I remember, and this was a number of years ago now, this is probably 2011, 2012, that Brian and I had just, it was in the early times when my partner and I were just early days of dating, and we had gone to the Art Institute here in Chicago, and I don't even know if it was like a permanent part of the exhibit or if it was something that was just up at the time, but there was a lot of Native American artifacts in the exhibit hall, and the exhibit hall was packed, and we walked in, and I was like in my clairvoyant training at the time, and so like my extrasensory perception was like kind of cranked pretty high, and as soon as we walked in, I was like, we are not supposed to be in here. We have to get out of here right now, because it was the way that these artifacts were sort of like, displayed. And, I'm sure that any, curator who put them in there was, meaning to talk about the cultural relevance and the value and the importance of these artifacts. But it just felt like these are not artifacts to be looked at as art. They are lived things, and they are plunder, Yeah. And we just were like, okay, see ya, we're out of here, and the place was packed, and I'm sure lots of people learned a lot of cool stuff, but it just felt like, no, this is not art. This is like cultural stuff that needs a different context. And so I was just curious, like how that manifests, in your facility.
Well, it's complicated, right? Like, have you ever been to the British Museum? Like, I mean, it's
yeah.
Like that's 100% what that experience is like. It's like, oh,
right.
Hello, we're the British Empire, and we're just going to take your stuff, and now it's ours, right?
Right.
So you go through that experience, and you can have a very complicated response to it, right? We have another museum here in Scottsdale. It's like the Museum of the American West or something, and it is all pioneer Native American, cowboy and Indian kind of imagery. And this is my personal opinion. That feels a little bit more distasteful to me. I think our museum tries to be a little bit more sensitive, and they're trying to show things that are, I think, like they're relaying specific cultural details about indigenous groups, right? Like we have one painting that I like a lot called "Offerings to the Little People," and it's essentially showing a planting ceremony where members of the Crow tribe would basically, as they're planting tobacco in the ground, they would have like little like offerings, right? Like so little boots and little bits of bundles of food that they would place on sticks as they're planting the tobacco in the ground. And the belief was, the ceremony was that those offerings would entice spirits that live in the ground to come up and help the plants grow. And when we tell those stories to people who are visiting the museum, especially kids, sometimes like people like, oh, that's interesting, like that's they almost think like it's a quaint tradition. But then you say, well, wait a minute, let's compare that to to other culture groups. Like, can you think of times where like maybe we leave offerings to spirits, right, in a Christian tradition or in other religious traditions, right? And then people like have that connection, right, where they're like, oh yeah, I do leave offerings at church and things like that. And then then I think it starts to make people feel more connected to groups that they maybe didn't feel quite so connected with. So that kind of stuff I think is a net positive, right?
Sure.
It's just the bang bang cowboys and Indian stuff that I think gets us in trouble, right? But like that is a huge genre in art. What do you do with it, right?
Right. Well, and again, I was especially curious just knowing that you're down in the Southwest and that, it's kind of like Native American people are there and coming to your museum,
Right.
know, and so how do you have those conversations when people are like, hello, we're not actually just like exhibits on a wall,
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I agree. It's again, I think you have to focus on like how do we present these things that are going to be a net good for everybody that sees it, right? Is this imagery that people are going to learn something from? Are they going to have a connection? Are they going to walk away from this feeling like they had a good experience, or is it just is it kitsch, right? That's the hard part.
So changing subjects, like what's up at the museum right now that you're like super, super jazzed about? Like, what are some favorite pieces that like you get like secretly really excited when you get to like take a tour group to see, X, Y, or Z?
The Legends of Speed exhibit is a big deal right now. The cars are really cool. I mean, like I said, it's 22 racing cars throughout automobile racing history. That's just, I mean, they're just incredible, right? And getting to learn a little bit about the engineering and stuff is pretty neat. We have an exhibit that's coming up about we actually have a really great fashion curator, a couple of really great fashion curators, and we're working on an exhibit right now that's like fashions as they come out of India and how they've influenced fashion in the United States and in Europe, and I'm really looking forward to that. That's kind of cool. Like I didn't realize that like saris, like do you know what like a sari is like is a garment that women wear in India and other parts of the world where it's wrapped around in these really elaborate designs. Those things are over 3 yards long. They're massive pieces of cloth that just learning how to wrap them as an art form in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff's really cool. Like I didn't think that would be something that I would be interested in. Like I'm not a big fashion person, but learning about that stuff is really interesting, right?
Yeah, a couple years ago, my partner and I were in Los Angeles at the Getty, and they had I forget what they call it. It was like icons of fashion or something, and 100 years worth of different sort of like iconic silhouettes in women's dresses and stuff like that, and that was really inspiring because they had the dresses up, and then they also had literature and things that were from the same time period, so you could see sort of like discussions of socially, how these articles of clothing, marked status and stuff like that. And yeah, I thought that was really cool. So the saris sound amazing.
Yeah. We also had this was last year, we had a video performance exhibit called The Visitors by an Icelandic artist, Ragnar Kjartansson. I'm probably mangling his name, so I apologize. We co-own that piece with the Artists of Chicago, Phoenix Art Museum, and I forget who our other, it might be Dallas Fort Worth, I forget, but anyway, we have a copy that we share with multiple other museums, and it's a really incredible piece. It's a music performance, right? This Ragnar got a bunch of his friends together, and they wrote a song, right? And they went up to a house in upstate New York, and that was like a former big real estate magnate. So this big, huge, I mean, just enormous mansion, right? Just full of all this beautiful 19th century stuff, and basically a musician would set up their space and a recording equipment and camera equipment in several rooms throughout the house. And so I think there were 9 total screens, 9 performers, and so you would watch a woman who's playing the viola, you would watch him, the artist, he's in a bathtub and he's playing a guitar, and then a drummer, et cetera, a guy playing piano. And the piece goes on for a full hour, right? It's like an hour and 10 minutes or something like that. And his stuff is all about how performance changes over long periods of time. It's about like the endurance and how the expression changes, and as you move through the exhibit is broken up into 9 different screens, and you walk through the room, and as you stand in front of a screen, the audio is more focused on that performer, right? So the audio changes as you walk through the space, and like that part is all very cool, and the technical part about it and the engineering part about it I think is really interesting. But the part that really got me, that I thought was incredible, is like watching people's reactions to it, watching the audience, like the song. And if you YouTube it, you can listen to it. It's very like nostalgic and kind of like it's just, it makes people think about old loves, I think, and like, so you watch people watch this, right, and they just like, they get this kind of like wistful look in their eyes, and they might cuddle a little bit with whoever it is they're with, and they would just kind of sit down in the space and just kind of chill like they were watching a concert, or they would move from piece to piece, and you could tell like whether they liked it or didn't like it depending on which bit they were looking at, and sometimes it would change as they walked through the exhibit. And if I had just had that experience just in our museum, that would have been really cool to me. But what was amazing was this is a pretty popular piece all over the world right now. And I got to go to, it was at the Hammer in Los Angeles. It was at the ICA in Boston. And I saw it in some other place that I can't recall. And like, you would go and you would see it. It would be a little different because the space would be different, right? But everybody's reactions were always the same. Like, it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, where you're from, anything about your background, who your partner was, or whether you did have a partner or didn't have a partner. It didn't matter, right? Like, you just see these like people having this connection with this experience and with the music that's the same, and just that, like, I don't know, that fundamental kernel of like unity that we all have, just in our shared humanity, that when else are you going to get the privilege of being able to experience that in such a like fundamental way? Like, it's really cool.
That's magical.
Yeah.
Well, hey, like, I know that you have a couple pieces of art that you were going to help me learn to see a little bit better. Would you like to walk me through some of what you do?
Let's do it. Okay, so I sent you 2 links. Open up the first one, and it should be a photo of a woman sitting in a chair.
I have opened it, and I'm looking at the woman sitting in a chair.
All right, so let's. So I have a little title for our little tour. We're gonna do a mini tour, just like we were at the museum, and I'm gonna call it Drama and Trauma. And the reason for that, like, I wanted to pick pieces that were kind of a little bit more on the exciting side, just because we're doing something that should be primarily a visual experience in an audio medium. So I wanted to pick stuff that's got like a little bit of pizzazz to it. Otherwise, people would fall asleep. So Drama and Trauma it is, right? And so this first one we're going to call Drama, right? And what I want you to do, look at the piece and from top to bottom, right? And just kind of look at the room where she's sitting, what she's wearing, and from that look on her face, right? Just what do you think is on her mind? Like, tell me what you're thinking about right now.
She just looks like she's stewing about something. Like someone has either disappointed her or gotten her angry, and she's locked up inside these emotions. Like, she's staring off into the distance, like she's looking towards the viewer, so she's looking towards me, but she's definitely not making eye contact with me. Like, she's very much inside her own head, it looks like.
Okay. Yeah, I could see what you think. Like, what do you see in the piece? Like, and I very much want us to focus on the things that we can see and describe. Like, what do you see in the piece that makes you think that? Besides her stare.
Yeah, her posture, the way that she's got her chin resting on her hand, and the fact that she's kind of hunched over, that she's got that second, her other arm, her left arm sort of folded across her lap, and her legs are crossed. There's sort of a crouched inwardness that seems very, very internal.
Right. Like her, I totally see why you say that. Like, her body language is totally closed to us, right? She has her legs crossed away from us. Her arms are crossed in a contrasting position, right? She's just very closed, right? I
totally, yeah.
See that. So, classically speaking, right, this is a portrait. And portraits usually contain clues as to who the subject is or what they do, right? The artist will usually, include things, either something they're holding or something in the background that tells us something about, the person that we're looking at. So looking at this piece, take some guesses. Like, what do you think? Who do you think she is, and maybe what she does?
Well, there's books sort of in the corner behind her, sort of, to her right. And it looks like there's like 4 books, and then it looks like, I don't know, magazines or sheet music or something underneath them.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the opposite side, there is a plate with 2 apples down near her feet, near the leg of the chair. And there's a little piece of art that you can see tacked up on the wall, or on the wall behind her. But otherwise the room is pretty sparse. So it looks like she's, with a unadorned wood floors, looks like she's well dressed and looks professional and looks well put together, but looks like maybe sort of not a person of means.
Okay, sure. So I'll give you some clues, right? This painting was made in 1932, right? So this is right in the middle of the Depression in the United States, right? So now, given the stuff that you pointed out, like what do you think she might do? And actually, more importantly, what do you think maybe her relationship might be to the artist?
It looks like I mean, she gives me the vibe of like a school teacher or a student or a tutor, something, sort of a young woman, youngish, woman in her late teens, early 20s, probably, who might be in some sort of, teaching or tutoring capacity, like life of the mind in some way, but again, with sort of some austerity. So I'm guessing maybe, a sister or a friend, because it doesn't look like, it's hard to say what the level of intimacy is between the artist and the portrait, the woman in the portrait.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't seem romantic, but it also could be like, screw you for making me sit here and be painted. I mean, I could see that too.
Yeah, it's funny. So this piece, when you see it in person, it's really large. Like it's probably about 5 feet tall, and it's an oil painting. So there's a little bit more texture than what we can convey digitally, right? And when you walk in, like she is just scowling at you, like there is no mistaking like that she is not pleased, right? Okay, great. Yeah. So we see books, we see apples. Maybe we're getting a little bit of student vibes. So she actually is a student. Her name is Elizabeth Ruskin, and the person painting it is her teacher, right? An artist named Lou Davis, who is from Arizona, and is well known and loved because he kind of helped found our museum. This is from an early phase in his life when he had moved to New York and was going to school. And he actually dropped out of art school. He wasn't doing too well academically. Then somehow he was able to actually get a job teaching painting at a girls' school in upstate New York. And again, this was during the Depression, right? And so he by all accounts was a pretty handsome guy. So he's got a pretty good job. He's a successful artist, and he's teaching at a girls' school. So predictably, he was a little popular with his students. And so this woman, Elizabeth Ruskin, she was pursuing him romantically. Like she wanted to go out on a date with him. But at the time, like all he really needed was models. Like he needed to create, right? So he wanted people to sit for him. So he said, okay, I'll take you out if you sit for me. So, this is a date. How do you think it's going?
Not what she was hoping for.
No, I don't think it's going really great. So like if let's flip it another way. Like if you can you imagine a time in your life where you were with a partner, and if they were going to paint a portrait of you, what do you think that portrait might look like?
Well, I mean, yes, it varies person to person.
Right.
Yeah, it would, if someone were to make a portrait of me, I think that Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, what sides of my personality would be shown would be dependent on, what the nature of our connection was, what I was doing at that point in my life. If I was, doing more of the music or doing more of the writing,
Yeah.
doing more of the psychic stuff. I could see that different obsessions would come to the fore depending on how people saw me.
How do you think she feels about, like, if she could see this portrait later in life, how do you think she would feel about it?
She would probably think like, "Oh Lord, why did I waste my time pining after this guy? Like, I was so young and so cute, and I had this like great fashion sense, and why am I sitting here scowling when I could have been like getting my life?"
Could you imagine having your early 20s dating mistakes immortalized in for all time?
Oh, that's delicious.
Yeah, wouldn't that be wild? Like, yeah, and they did not succeed romantically. Later on, Lou Davis would go on to marry a woman who was a sculptor, and they actually have a really great story. But unfortunately, these two lovebirds did not work out. But I just like this portrait is just like, when have you ever seen a portrait that captures something more genuine about somebody's, like, their like spirit, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and he named it, the name of the portrait is The Rebel, right? So,
Uh,
like, could you imagine, like, did he, like, this is just me asking a question, right? Like, did he start with this in mind, or did he end on this? Like, how do you, like, you sit down with a person and you've asked them to sit for you for a painting for a long time? Like, these are not trivial sittings, right? They take hours. So, like, was this a look that she gave him at the very beginning and he was just like, yes, done, I'm doing this now, right? Or did this evolve over the course of the painting? I think that idea is really fascinating.
no, she's great. I just, her expression is so fantastic. The hairdo, just the whole bit.
Yeah, no, it's really good. All right, so okay, so now this was a little bit of drama. Now we're going to move on to some trauma. All right, you ready?
Okay,
All right,
yeah.
so we're going to talk about another portrait, and this is probably the most famous painting in Phoenix Art Museum's collection. Okay. Okay, so this is called The Suicide of Dorothy Hale. It's by Frida Kahlo. Hold on one second. Let me get my image up on my side. Great. So this was painted in 1939, and just to kind of warm up a little bit, I want you to describe to me what you see. Just look from the top to the bottom and tell me what you see.
Well, I mean, before I even describe any of it, like, I have to say that it immediately, to me, looks like the Tower card from the Coleman Waite Smith tarot deck, where you have this sort of building rising up in the middle, and then one figure in motion falling, and then one figure on the ground. But yeah, this is amazing. Yeah, it looks like a Chicago or New York City skyscraper in the dead center of the painting, and yeah, you see a woman in gray falling about in the middle, almost in the exact middle of the painting, and then at the bottom, it looks like it's probably supposed to be the same woman, but in black, sort of draped in black fabric with I don't know, some sort of corsage or decorative element up at her shoulder. There's writing underneath her, sort of where her foot is dangling. It's kind of like a what's the term? Where it looks like it's like a illusion that it looks like the pedestal, her foot is sort of hanging off the painting, and the frame too has the colors match what's in the painting. So the outside of the frame has is painted to look like sky and feathers and clouds, and then the bottom is rough hewn and kind of bloody. It has like sort of red streaks on it that look like blood from the body where it's fallen.
Yeah. Are there any similarities to the last portrait? Like, compare the two in your head now. Like, what's similar between the two of them?
These dark-haired women looking in distress, in varying degrees of distress, looking out toward the viewer.
Yeah, she's looking right at us, right? In both instances where we can actually see her eyes, we've got kind of like this sequence, right, where you can see just a little tiny, shadow of her, jumping from the top of the building, and then she's kind of tumbling down in kind of like, it's almost like a comic book, right? Like this sequential art, right? As she gets down to the bottom, and in the last two where we can actually see her face, like she's looking directly at us, right?
Mm-hmm.
so I think those two things are kind of similar, right? What do you, kind of like we were talking about in the last painting, what do you get a feeling there's a relationship between this woman and Frida? And if so, what do you think it might be?
It looks like deep sympathy and understanding, and sort of it looks like Frida, like a way of Frida trying to understand someone's distress and understand someone's decision that they may be making about ending their life, or the things that would draw a person to either actually go through with it or to even imagine doing so. So it looks like, yeah, probably someone that she knows fairly well and has respect for, because I was going to say affection, but there's such a nobility to the way that the figure is drawn that it seems like it's more than affection. It's respect and regard and sort of wanting to honor someone in a way.
Wow. Yeah. I could totally see why you would say that. Yeah. So they actually do have a relationship, right? Dorothy Hale and Frida were friends. So Dorothy Hale, she ran away from home when she was a teenager, and she went to New York City. This is in New York, and this was painted in 1939. She killed herself in 1938. And Dorothy Hale, she wanted to be an actress, and she had some modest success in New York for a while, and then she married a wealthy man, and she lived in Paris for a while, and she was studying sculpture, and then that marriage ended in divorce, and then she met another artist who was a famous muralist, and she married him. And then he died about 5 years after they were married. He was in a car accident in California. He drove off the road, and she was kind of left in debt. She had very expensive taste at this point because she'd been traveling in pretty, expensive upper class New York circles, right, for a long time. So her career was kind of flagging, and she was in quite a lot of debt, and she was struggling quite a bit. She had a couple of relationships that failed after her marriage. One man, notably, he was a member of FDR's staff. The gossip papers were like, having a field day with talking about them and, how they were getting married. And then he kind of broke it off suddenly. And there were rumors that FDR might have, or Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, who might have forced him, who didn't want him to marry her for some reason. And so the tabloids kind of went crazy with that information. And so she was kind of humiliated publicly, right? And so she kind of had she got a bunch of her friends together, and she told them that she was having a going away party, and gathered them at her home, and they had a good time. And then when all the booze was gone, she sent everybody home and said there was no more. And she wrote some suicide notes, and then she jumped, right?
Wow.
One of her friends was another woman named Claire Booth Luce, who also was friends with Frida Kahlo. And Claire Booth Luce went to Frida Kahlo and told her that she wanted, asked Frida to paint she actually asked for a recuerdo, which is like a Spanish word for memory. It's a style of portrait. She wanted her to paint something to give to Dorothy Hale's mother, right, as a remembrance. So given that information, how do you think Claire Booth Luce felt about that?
Yeah, this is a pretty brutal remembrance. I mean, it's very honest and very unflinching, but not the thing that you give to the mother of a suicide.
No, she was very upset, right? So Claire Booth Luce was actually a closer personal friend of Dorothy Hale than Frida was. Like, Frida just knew her because they were traveling in kind of the similar art circles. But Claire Booth Luce, the patron, she would had been in a play with Dorothy Hale. Like, they kind of traveled around, and kind of there was a group of gal pals that they were kind of famous at the time, and so she knew her quite well. So yeah, she was pretty upset. So if you look at the painting up at the top, near the kind of that gold roof on the building, you see how there's kind of like a curved arch up at the top?
Yeah.
in the clouds. So that was originally, there was an angel up there, and there was a banner that basically said, that this was a painting of Dorothy Hale that was commissioned by Claire Booth Luce. It actually named her by name, right?
Oh, wow.
And she was like, absolutely not. I want my name immediately. And then down at the bottom, if you look in the red text just below her foot, you see how there's kind of like a weird gray space there that's like kind of blanked out. That
Sure,
also
yeah.
identified Claire Booth Luce as the patron for the painting, and she also had that painted out too.
Oh, damn.
It was like, I don't want my name on this at all, right? So okay, so some people think that there was miscommunication between Claire Booth Luce and Frida Kahlo, right? Claire Booth Luce specifically asked for a recuerdo, but this kind of comes back as a retablo, which is a different style of portrait that was popular in Latin America. Why do you think that Frida, you talked about this a little bit more, but I'd like you to kind of explore it a little bit more. Like, why do you think Frida would choose to paint Dorothy this way?
It's the most intimate way that you could paint someone in this circumstance. It's because any other way is hagiography, right? I mean, if you paint her knowing how she died as this sort of beautiful figure, I mean, which she clearly was, based on the figure at the bottom, it would be avoiding the whole reality. And so I can see. I mean, obviously it would be disturbing if you were like her friend and who were like, you were hoping for something just sort of like sanitized and
More
sort of,
portrait, right.
Yeah. I could see why that would be upsetting, but I could also see from Frida's perspective, I mean, as the brilliant genius that she was, just being like, nope, this is life. This is what it is,
Right. And Frida, she was the style of retablo is like, it's generally an image of a saint, either like in the moment, just like as divine, like providence is going to save them from dying, right? Like an angel comes in and stops an arrow or something along those lines, or it's in the moment immediately preceding or following their death, right? Where you're like, it's highlighting their suffering, like this is the thing that they went through in order to achieve sainthood, right? So I think Frida was probably trying to say that she was a saint, or at least comparing her to one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this piece is great. And like when people like, I'm really impressed with the way you talked about it. Usually when people look at this and we tell the story about Claire Booth Luce, like, people don't attach so early to the idea of that this is a noble vision of Dorothy Hale, right? Like, people are usually like, oh my God, this is so violent. They have a probably a similar experience to what Claire Booth Luce did, right? Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about those photos of there's that famous photo from 9/11 of the guy who jumped, and where he's like completely up and down, perpendicular to the screen with just like a little bend in his knee, and it's so disturbing and so striking and such a beautiful piece of art that it sort of puts me in a similar mind frame to this, where it's kind of like, well, it's life, it's life and death. It's all there.
Yeah, another piece of information that I think is good to know. This was around about the time, like, Frida was living in New York City because she was estranged from her husband Diego Rivera, because they had, he had cheated on her, right? He had a string of infidelities, even though their relationship was complicated and there was quite a lot of sex on both sides. She, was living separated from him at the time, right? So, I don't think it's a stretch to say that she was probably projecting a little bit of her own feelings of betrayal onto the experience that Dorothy Hale went through, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is really fun. I'm really, this is really, this is a different way to tour paintings. I never tried this overall.
No, I love it. Like, thank you so much. Because I enjoy art and have very little, book learning on art, other than what I've sort of like gleaned in my years in book publishing, when I've worked on a couple books about art. So I'm super, super open to like, just being led through those images. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was fun.
Yeah, and thank you for talking about the docent process. Like, I just am fascinated by that. You were just like, you know what? This is something that I'm psyched about, and I'm going for it. I love that about you. I love your sort of restless, creative, and intellectual energy that just you give it a target and it goes, and it creates this beautiful experience for you in your life. I admire that so much about the full tilt action that you live your life with.
I don't like to do anything like halfway. I'm just not. That's not me. That's not how I do.
So if there's other information that people want to find out about either the Phoenix Museum or about the work that you're doing, is there any place that you would like to point them to, websites or such?
You can go to phoenixart.org as the museum's website. You can. We have. We're open 6 days a week. Actually, no, 7 days. 6 days a week. So we're closed on Mondays. We have some opportunities for people to come for free or pay as what they wish, a voluntary donation. First Fridays of the month are voluntary donation, and then on Wednesday evenings, you can come, and I usually tour on Wednesday evenings, so you can come and hang out with me and share in some cool art stuff. And then I also have an Instagram that I'm kind of poking at a little bit, where I'm putting up paintings and kind of like brainstorming questions on things that I think would be fun to do during tours. So if you want to come play with me on Instagram, it's Michael Sherron. It is me.
Amazing. Well, we'll put that in the I'll put that in the show notes for people. Thank you so much, Michael. This was like a real pleasure to chat with you about all things artistic today.
You're welcome. It was fun.
So what a lovely chat, right? I hope you're maybe feeling inspired to go visit whatever art museum is nearest to the place you live and to engage with the art there in a more playful and open way, and also to appreciate the incredible work that the docents on staff there are doing. And even if fine art per se isn't necessarily your thing, I hope you're feeling a little more energized now about returning to your own creative projects with open-hearted inquiry. And I personally am feeling really inspired to find new ways to create understanding when I'm in conversation with others by taking that technique of deeply listening to everyone's ideas without immediately dismissing any of them as wrong or bad or even just impractical. I feel like this is a borderline rebellious stance to take in the world right now, this notion of hearing each other out and building on positives. And what could be more of a work of art than that? As a reminder, you can find Michael on Instagram as his username is Michael Sherron, MichaelSherron. And as always, you can find me online at queenofpeaches.com. Bye for now.